Hello students. So now we'll be discussing about the next part of your RPD, that is your rest and your rest seat. You would have normally heard of the term occlusal rest in your RPD. So let's study what is this rest and what is this rest seat. So your rest, this occlusal rest is present in your RPD and the rest seat is present in the patient's mouth. Right, first I'll define what is a rest, and then I'll tell you what is a rest seat. So an rest is that part of the RPD. Rest is that part of the RPD which contacts the tooth, to dissipate your forces. That part of the RPD which contacts the surfaces of your teeth to dissipate the forces, right? So let's say this is an RPD, this is a distal extension case. We have a tooth here. We replace it by a RPD, artificial teeth. So when your occlusal forces are being put or subjected on your RPD, if the entire occlusal forces, just imagine it is falling transferred to the underlying tissue or the bone, then it will cause bone resorption. Some amount of forces has to be transferred to the abutment tooth also. Right? During studying the classification, I told you, in your class 3 Kennedy's classification and short span class 4, they are examples of purely tooth supported. Whereas your class 1, class 2 and long span class 4 are examples of tooth tissue supported. So always the abutment tooth has to bear your occlusal forces so that the RPD can function effectively. And that part of the RPD which does this purpose, which transfers some forces to the abutment tooth, is called as a rest. Right? And the place where the rest sits in the patient's mouth is called as rest seat. So this rest seat, just imagine this is a tooth, the abutment tooth, and this is your rest, which is connected by the minor connector to the major connector like this. So this will be the major connector, this will be the minor connector, and this will become the rest. The part where the rest has to sit in the patient's mouth, you prepare it artificially, a space for the rest to come and occupy, to sit or to seat itself in the patient's mouth on the abutment tooth is called as a rest seat. This is called as the rest seat. And the preparation of the rest seat, is a part of mouth preparation stage. It's a part of your mouth preparation. Mouth preparation, I told you, before making the final impression, right? You make a diagnostic cast, you survey it, you determine the path of insertion, you create undercuts, you prepare the path of guide planes and all that. And then also you do a rest seat preparation, right? You scoop out, you remove enamel, you do enameloplasty and prepare a space for the seating of the rest, which is called as rest seat. Now, I told you, your rest, it transfers forces to the abutments. And mainly it is responsible for dissipation. Mainly it is responsible for the dissipation of vertical forces more than horizontal forces. I repeat, if at all you get a question that your rest mainly helps to dissipate your vertical forces, the answer should be vertical forces are more effectively dissipated by your rest compared to the horizontal forces. But then again, if you get an option C as both vertical and horizontal, then please go for this, option C. That is, again I repeat, your rest, it transfers or it dissipates both horizontal and vertical forces to the abutment. But mainly it is a vertical followed by the horizontal forces. Right. Now, your rest can be mainly of three types. Rest mainly it can be of three types based on the surface in which it is resting. You can either have a occlusal rest, when the rest is seating on the occlusal surface of the teeth. You can have a cingulum rest, also called as lingual rest. It is resting, as the name suggests, on the cingulum of your anterior teeth. And thirdly, you will have the incisal rest. And this is also the order of preference, the order of choice. The order of choice will be like this. Always it will be the occlusal rest, followed by the cingulum rest, followed by the incisal rest, in providing a good support for your RPD. Right. Now, this occlusal rest I told you, you make a rest seat in the occlusal surface, and the rest is fabricated like this. Cingulum rest, if this is an anterior tooth, this is the cingulum, the rest will occupy this space. And in case of incisal rest, if this is an anterior again, the rest will be seating on the incisal surface like this. These are three different types of rest. If it is an occlusal rest, then it will be triangular shaped. This rest seat that we are making, it will be triangular shape. I'll explain. Most important type of rest. If it is a cingulum rest, then it will be an inverted V-shaped. It will be an inverted V-shaped like this. Inverted V-shape. And if it is an incisal rest, it will be flat, occupying the incisal surface. Right? Now, coming to the most important rest, that is the occlusal rest. Your occlusal rest. Imagine this is your abutment premolar like this. This is your abutment premolar. You create a rest like this. Which is roughly triangular in shape. Right? Why I'm telling you this is a triangle is that the width of the occlusal rest, it should taper. Towards the center of the tooth. Right? It should not be like this. The rest should be somewhat like this. This apex of this triangle should be towards the center. That is why we call it as a triangular shape. Second, it should have, first thing is, it should be triangle shaped. Second thing, it should have no sharp angles. It should be completely rounded. If it is sharp, then what will happen? If you have a sharp, then there will be friction. The occlusal rest, which is a metal, and the rest seat, it can have friction. There can be interlocking. You're removing, wearing the RPD. So it will exert orthodontic forces on the tooth. It will exert orthodontic forces on the abutment. That is why it should have no sharp angles. Always all the surface should be rounded so that it will have a smooth movement. It should allow smooth placement and removal without any friction, just like a ball and socket joint. It should provide a smooth gliding movement when you are removing and inserting and replacing the RPD. It should not bind. There should not be no binding. Binding means locking. Once it gets locked and you try to remove it, it will exert forces on the teeth. Right? It happens. The actual cast partial denture is heavy. It is made up of metal. So you remove it 3 times per day for, let's say, 2 years daily. Your abutment can become mobile. So rest preparation is very critical in the making of a cast partial denture or an RPD. Now, this shape, I told you it should be triangle, and the floor of this rest seat, should again have gentle curves. It should have gentle curves. That is, it should have a saucer or a spoon shape. Like this. It should not be flat. It should have gentle curves. and the floor is always inclined towards the center. The floor is always inclined or sloping towards the center of the tooth, the center of the rest. Next and most important point, put a star, that if you are having a minor connector which is going as an occlusal rest like this angle between the minor connector and the rest should always be acute, that is less than 90 degrees. It should always be an acute angle, multiple times frequently asked question. Let's imagine if it is 90 degree or more, if the angle between the minor connector and the rest is 90 degree or it is more, like this. This is more than 90 degrees and this is 90 degrees. What will happen? If it is more than 90 degrees, let's say you're having an abutment over here. You're having an abutment over here. This rest will slide off. There will be sliding of the rest. Sliding off of the rest. It will slip. Occlusal rest will slip away from the abutment tooth. If it is more than 90 or if it is obtuse, angle between the minor connector and the rest, if it is more than 90 degrees or obtuse angle, it will slip off. It will be ineffective. And if it is 90 degrees, there will be maximum stress concentration and there is chance of breakage of the rest. There is chance of breakage of the rest when it is subjected to masticatory load. See, you should think practically, clinically. If this is a tooth, if you are making an occlusal rest slightly above, then what will happen? It will be in hyperocclusion. It will be in hyperocclusion, high point. So always the rest should be fabricated in such a way that it should terminate at the level of the normal tooth. That is why you're removing the tooth structure. You're doing an enameloplasty. You do an enameloplasty. You remove the enamel. You prepare a space for the rest. It's like you're doing a class 1 cavity. You're preparing a space for the amalgam. You do a cavity preparation, something kind of that, a saucer shaped with right angles, a triangular shape. You make a space so that the rest can go and occupy. It should not be high. If it is high, again, it will be subjected to occlusal forces and it will fracture off. Right? Coming to the next part, in case of rest breakage or in case of rest fracture, do not try to repair. Don't repair it. Instead, you remake it. Because rest, since it is a very critical component, if it is fractured, if you try to join it or weld it together, no. You always redo a rest. Always refabricate or you make it a rest. Now, this rest seat, again I'm telling, it is prepared in the tooth like this. And this rest will go and occupy in this space. So this acts as an area where caries will develop. Because you have sacrificed tooth structure, you have prepared a saucer where the rest will go and seat itself. So it will act as an area where caries will develop, and this rest is the area or the main cause. Your caries on the rest is the main cause of failure of RPD. Write it down. The main cause of failure of RPD is not breakage, right? It is not ridge resorption or anything. It is caries on the rest. Caries between the rest and your abutment teeth. Since you have removed the enamel and since there is a micro gap, however precisely you make the rest, there will be a micro gap present where bacteria can seep inside and accumulate and cause caries. So this rest seat should be cleaned thoroughly by the patient. Special instruction should be given. That is, you are removing the RPD at night. When you are brushing, this rest sheet should be thoroughly cleaned because it will act as an area of failure and caries development on the RPD. Now, this caries is also the main cause for failure of your FPD. Because even in your FPD, you are preparing your abutment teeth and you are making a crown. So again, there can be micro leakages beneath the crown leading to failure of the FPD. Right? Now coming to the dimensions. Coming to the dimensions of your occlusal rest. dimensions of your occlusal rest. If this is the entire tooth, if this is the premolar in which you are making the rest and the rest seat, and let's say this is the mesial and distal, this is the buccal and lingual surface, your mesiodistal, the mesiodistal extent of the rest, it should be 1/3 to 1/2 the total mesiodistal width of the tooth. Mesiodistal extent of the rest should be 1/3 to 1/2 of the total distance, whereas the buccolingual extent, it should be half of the buccolingual width. This buccolingually, it should be half the buccolingual width. These are the dimensions by which you prepare an occlusal rest. Asked previously, mesiodistally 1/3 to half of the total mesiodistal width of the rest. That should be the dimension of your rest seat. Buccolingually, half of your total buccolingual dimension of the tooth. These are the dimensions of your occlusal rest, right? Of your occlusal rest. Whereas the dimensions of your lingual rest and your incisal rest, not important, but still. For your cingulum rest, also your incisal rest and the cingulum rest, also called as lingual rest, and the incisal rest, the dimensions, mesiodistally, it should be 2.5 to 3 millimeters. Buccolingually, it should be 2 millimeters. And depth of your cingulum rest should be 1.5 millimeters. Whereas coming to your incisal rest, it should have a width of 2.5 millimeters and a depth of your 1.5 millimeters. These are the dimensions of cingulum and incisal rest, but not that important. This dimension should be known to you. 1/3 to half of mesiodistal and half of your buccolingual width. Right. Now, let's say this is again your abutment tooth. You are making a rest seat like this. You are making a rest seat like this. It should be acute angle. This reduction, what reduction that you're doing here, this will determine the amount of reduction, will determine the thickness of the rest. It will determine the thickness of your occlusal rest. And mainly, it will depend upon the amount of reduction of your marginal ridges. The amount of reduction of your marginal ridges. How much your strength of the ridge and breakage. Everything depends upon the reduction of your marginal ridge. How much thoroughly, effectively you have reduced the marginal ridge. Because it is at this point, this joint, where maximum stress is falling. The joint between the rest and this minor connector, that acute angle that I told you, this is the point which is subjected to maximum load. The weakest point, basically. The weakest point of the rest is the junction. So at this junction, there will be stress concentration and there will be breakage. So marginal ridge reduction will determine your ridge rest strength and breakage, and the minimum of 1.5 millimeter of marginal ridge reduction should be there, or marginal ridge reduction should be done to prevent breakage, of the rest. Right? Now, coming to the functions of your rest, most importantly, it should provide vertical support. Second, it prevents impingement. Vertical support, you're understanding, right? To withstand the masticatory load, that is support. Next, it prevents impingement, or that is overpressing. Overpressing of the RPD in the tissue. Because the rest, it will act as a stop. This rest, when the rest is seating on the rest seat, you cannot press it down, you cannot press the RPD even down further. So it will act as a vertical stop, thereby preventing impingement or overpressing of the RPD. Third, again, it derives support from the abutment, or derives support from the abutment teeth, thereby resisting the masticatory load. And third, it prevents food impaction. That is the requirement of a rest. That is, there should not be any food impaction between the tooth and the minor connector. It should be designed in such a way so as to avoid food impaction between the tooth and the minor connector, else it will lead to caries and failure of the RPD. Mainly, it provides support. Coming to the third part of your rest, that is the types of your rest. I told you rest, depending upon its position, it can be occlusal rest, cingulum rest, or incisal rest. Right? Occlusal rest we have discussed so far. This cingulum rest and the incisal rest, I told you, they are rarely given. Still, I have mentioned given you the dimensions of your cingulum rest and incisal rest. This cingulum rest, preferably, it should be given on canines. Preferably, it should be given on canines because canines are strong teeth. Right? And if these canines are not possible, not available for your cingulum rest, then you should give it on multiple incisors, not on a single incisor. Cingulum rest should either be given on a canine or it should be given on a multiple rest. If you have read about the major connector of mandible, there was something called as a cingulum bar. Right? I told you it acts as a rest. The cingulum bar connects all the cingulum of your anteriors. That is, it is joining multiple incisors. So, multiple incisor can also be used to give a cingulum rest. Whereas incisal rest, the preferred area of location will again be the distal slope of the canine. Should again be the distal slope of the canine. Right? If you have a canine like this distal slope should be used as a incisal ridge. Preferably, you avoid giving rest on the incisors. Preferably, you avoid giving rest on the incisors because these incisors, they are weak teeth. They are weak teeth and they can be subjected to torquing forces. They can be subject to tipping and torquing forces, thereby orthodontically weakening or orthodontically exerting forces on the incisors, leading to their mobility. So, whenever possible, avoid a single incisal rest. Right? Be it cingulum or an incisal rest, you try to avoid it on an incisor. Always choose the canine. Whereas for giving an occlusal rest, always prefer a molar greater than a premolar. Because normally we'll be talking about premolar rest. But if the molar is available, try to give the rest on the molar. Normally in RPD will be distal extension, molars will be missing. That is why you choose a premolar. If molars are available, you choose a molar. Right? So you have three types: occlusal rest, molars greater than premolars, cingulum rest. The rest should be given on a canine or a multiple group of incisors. And an incisal rest, the area of choice should be the distal slope of the canine. Then least favorable will be the incisor or the incisal edge. Now, again, whenever possible, try to give an occlusal rest followed by a cingulum rest, and only if these two are not possible, you give an incisal rest. Right? This is the best. Now, coming to the next type or the next classification of your rests. Rests can also be classified as primary rests and secondary rests. Primary rests and secondary rest. A primary rest is the one, simple, clear-cut definition. A primary rest is the one which bears the clasp assembly. And it will be immediately adjacent to the edentulous span. It will be immediately adjacent to the edentulous space, whereas secondary rest, they may not or they need not bear the clasp assembly, might or might not have the clasp assembly, and they are present much anterior to the edentulous space. Much anterior to the edentulous space. Right? So clear-cut definition, the rest which bears the clasp assembly will be the primary rest. Secondary rest, also called as auxiliary rest or additional rests, they do not bear the clasp assembly, might not bear the clasp assembly, and are not located immediately adjacent to the edentulous span. This primary occlusal rest, mainly since it has the clasp, mainly it is associated, it does not provide, it is associated with your direct retainer, that is the clasp. Whereas auxiliary occlusal rests, they are most commonly associated or act as your indirect retainers, which will be discussed in the further videos. Auxiliary or secondary occlusal rests are most commonly associated with your indirect retention as the function. Now, your dimension of the rest seat, last point, dimension of the rest seat is always kept shallow in case of long span distal extension cases. Dimension of the rest seat is always kept shallower compared to the other cases in case of a long span distal extension case, because it might exert your orthodontic tipping forces. Right? Your rest is getting attached to your abutment teeth like this. Right? Long span distal extension cases will be subjected to excessive maximum occlusal load. Right? So if this part goes down a little bit, then this rest will exert a tipping forces on your abutment. It can lead to failure of the tooth. Right? In order to minimize these forces, the rest seat is kept shallower in long span distal extension cases compared to, let's say, a tooth supported class 3 case. A class 3 case will have a less amount of masticatory forces falling on it. In that case, you can keep it a wide occlusal rest. Whereas in your class 1 or a class 2 long span, you keep it as shallow, as narrow as possible. Right? So that is all about your occlusal rest or the types of rest and rest seat.